Welcome to Dubrovnik, the pearl of the Adriatic. This city is probably most famous for its massive stone walls seen here from the heights above the city, but there's a great deal more to see and much history, some of it quite appalling. Those walls were built to protect the city from invaders, and they have continued to do that job well into the 20th century. There is much to see here, including a tiny synagogue, one which I visited 3 times with my husband over the course of 40 years, and one which, to this day, most of the time cannot muster a minyan to have services. Let's take a look and learn a bit more of the history of this gorgeous city today on The Armchair Traveler. My name is Judy, and I love travel, history, and finding out what makes people tick. If you're enjoying my content, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your help means more people will see my content. If you want more information, I have a WordPress blog, a page on Facebook, and a Twitter handle. The addresses are here or in the information block at the bottom of the screen. Thank you and enjoy your visit. Dubrovnik was an easy overnight sail from our last stop in Split. If you're curious about Split and Diocletian's fabulous retirement villa, check out my other stops here on the channel. I admit that when I tried to study the history of this area back in college, as part of a class that covered the Ottoman Empire, my brain absolutely rebelled. There were so many different people, customs, nationalities, languages, and points of view packed in those days into a relatively small country once called Yugoslavia, which is now split up mostly along ethnic lines. I was a Soviet studies major in college. Most of this area had been incorporated into Yugoslavia, and that made it possible for me to ignore those complexities for a very long time. The Balkans is a geographical and cultural region in Southeast Asia that stretches, if you want to be generous, all the way from the Adriatic and Ionian Seas on the west to modern-day Greece, and by some definitions all the way to the Black Sea on the east. The most generous definition of the Balkans today includes Albania, which will be our next stop, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Croatia, where we are today, Kosovo, Moldova, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Romania, Serbia, Slovenia, and some parts of Greece and Turkey. That's about a dozen or more languages. The one thing the original city could not survive was an enormous earthquake in 1667. It had an estimated magnitude of 7.2 on the modern scale, which was revised up from earlier estimates of 6.4. Even at 6.4, this would have been a dangerous and destructive act. More than 3,000 people got killed or injured, and much of the city, as we know it today, was completely destroyed. If you're looking for remains of the Roman-era occupancy of the area, you're not going to be happy. Although it looks a great deal today as it did in this painting, which was from before the earthquake, depicting the city sometime before 1667, what we see now is mostly new, rebuilt in Renaissance style. An earthquake like that could lead to structural damage, landslides, and tsunamis if it occurs under the ocean, and all of these things happened. Many of the city's buildings were reduced to piles of rubble. All of the buildings on the Stradun, which is the main drag, and we'll visit it in a few minutes, were completely flattened. Much of the problem, though by no means all, came from landslides from those lovely hills overlooking the city. After the earthquakes came a tsunami which swamped the sea level area, and fires broke out, followed by lawless looting, I suspect initially just for people to survive and later on to find material to rebuild their homes. The city walls might not have been able to stop the damage inside the city from the earthquake, and they were damaged themselves, but they remained standing afterwards. Dubrovnik apparently goes back to about the 7th century AD, when it was established as a town they called Ragusa, one of several cities by that name and endlessly confusing to me, by residents fleeing advancing barbarians from their own city, which they had called Ragusa as well. Old Ragusa was sacked and burnt to the ground. The residents there fled to a large island, which is the basis of today's old town Dubrovnik. This image from Google Earth allows you to make out how the walled city was originally an island. The city was initially associated with Byzantium and then later with the Republic of Venice. It's actually quite close if you remember that map we looked at. Between the 14th and 19th centuries, Dubrovnik ruled itself as a free state. During the Napoleonic Wars, Dubrovnik was occupied by French imperial forces, and then the Republic of Ragusa was abolished and incorporated into the Napoleonic Kingdom of Italy. In the early 19th to 20th century, Dubrovnik was part of the Kingdom of Dalmatia. That was the same name that the Romans used for the area, but within the Austrian Empire. Dubrovnik became part of what was called the Kingdom of Yugoslavia immediately after it was created and was incorporated in 1929. During World War II, it was part of the Axis puppet state called the Independent State of Croatia, which it was not, before being reincorporated back into Yugoslavia. In 1991, during the Croatian War of Independence, Dubrovnik was besieged by the Yugoslav People's Armies for 7 months and suffered significant damage from shelling. The city withstood the siege and has rebuilt itself. The old city has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1979. Acquiring that designation takes work, money, and effort, and it should provide a certain amount of protected status in return. If you're curious about how UNESCO works, check out my WordPress blog. I'll put the address in the information box below. The massive stone walls that surround the city were built between the 13th and 16th centuries, and unlike some cities, which either mine their walls for building material or just let them fall over, have been kept in good repair ever since. They circle the old town and include forts, bastions, overlooks, and towers, complete to this day with cannons. They stand more than 80 feet high and are up to 20 feet thick on the landward side. They run 1.25 miles long, and walking them, which is why people go to Dubrovnik, involves climbing a lot of steps. Dubrovnik has a long history of withstanding sieges. It stood off the Yugoslav People's Army for 7 months in 1991 and 1992, although the city was badly damaged from Yugoslavs shelling it from higher ground inland. But the Yugoslavs weren't the first ones to try it. The Ottomans tried to take the city by siege in the 16th and 17th centuries, but failed, gave up, and as far as I know, they went home. This last photo shows an artist's interpretation of one night's firebombing of the city back in 1991. The entire city had been a supposedly protected UNESCO World Heritage Site going back to 1979. That knowledge apparently didn't perturb or even slow down the besiegers. The sign reads the name of the painter. It's something like Igor Grbić during the Serbian-Montenegrin attack on Dubrovnik in front of his burning house, and it gives the street address. My city guide told me that she was a young child during the siege and that her family never left. Croatian civilians bore the brunt of these attacks, which weren't entirely predictable, so they never knew when it was safe to go outside. The shelling damaged almost all of the city roofs, making many of the homes uninhabitable, except perhaps in the basement. The damage wasn't confined to the old town, however. Around 33,000 people from around the city fled the region, and many actually sought refuge inside the city walls, thinking they would be safer, but actually making things worse for everyone because of the overcrowding. They refused to give up, however, in part because they were quite certain that should the Serbs manage to take the town, far worse was in store for them, and I think they were probably right. This was a civil war, and there were bad people on both sides. Afterwards, each side accused the other of war crimes and genocide, but the International Court of Justice, which took its own sweet time, finally delivered a verdict in 2015 dismissing both claims. It said crimes against civilians had occurred, but that specific genocidal intent was not proven. The former president of Yugoslavia, a man named Slobodan Milosevic, was charged with genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Milosevic died before getting a verdict. Later on in our cruise, we're going to visit Valletta, Malta, and we'll see the restored city walls there. In the case of Valletta, the city has decided to leave the gates open and unlocked. They are lovely, but I'm not sure how wise an idea it was. Keep in mind that they made that decision after they saw what happened and how much the walls helped Dubrovnik withstand a siege. This is a St. Lawrence fortress, a cliffside fort just outside the medieval walls. Construction here probably dates back to almost the time when the walls were begun in the 11th century. Seen from above, you can see just how practical the designers and builders were. Instead of trying to adapt the site to the shape of a standard building, they adapted the building, roughly a triangle, to fit the size of the outcropping. And I might add, it's quite a formidable outcropping, too. The fort sits on top of a 37-meter-high cliff and was built to protect the city from attacks from Venice. They use the grounds today for summer Shakespeare performances, and if you're a Game of Thrones fan, this was the backdrop they used for the Red Keep in the King's Landing. The Pile Gate is the main entryway to the Old Town from the west, and sits in the middle of one of those rather formidable walls. It certainly is the grandest entryway to the city, and features 2 gates, one on the inside and one on the out. Originally, these were connected by a drawbridge. It comes complete with an interesting decoration, a statue of a man named Saint Blaise. Remember his name, as we're going to circle back to him at the cathedral. This is the main street of the city called the Stradun. When I first saw it, I imagined that it might be the remnants of a Roman road, but I was wrong. Things aren't always what they appear to be. Dubrovnik probably seems to be much larger than it is, although this image from Google Earth gives you some idea of the size inside the walls. This broad, straight street, paved with limestone, is the main drag of the city, called the Stradun. It's less than 1,000 feet from one end to the other, although when you start climbing the steps to go anyplace else, the city seems much bigger. Stradun didn't start out as a street. It was just a marshy channel which separated then Ragusa, on the seaward side, from a forest settlement called Dubrava, before the area was reclaimed, drained, and eventually paved in the 13th century. The street connects the Pile Gate, which we already visited, on the west, and the Polshik Gate on the east. Each end has a fountain as well, the large Onofrio fountain on the western side and the small Onofrio fountain to the east, as well as 2 bell towers. All of the buildings along the main drag collapsed during the 1667 earthquake. Afterwards, the street was rebuilt in uniform style. This rather large structure, with 16 water taps, is actually a fountain near the Pile Gate. It's named after its designer and part of the main water supply system of the city. Each of the 16 sides has a carved stone face. One of the masts is called the Jew's Mast, shown here in detail. Orlando's column stands in the Luza Square, right in front of St. Blaise Church. It dates from 1481 and is dedicated to a man called Orlando, at least in Italian, who we know as Roland. Orlando was a real person, a Frankish soldier born around 736. We know his date of death, August 15, 778, at the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass in the Pyrenees near the border between modern France and Spain. At the time, Charlemagne's army was retreating, and Orlando and his troops were covering the retreat when they were ambushed in the pass. The pass was a stop on a pilgrimage route that led to the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, where the remains of St. James the Apostle are said to have been buried. Orlando was a hero at the time, and his story has been immortalized, romanticized, and given quite a bit of decoration in a much later epic poem called the Song of Roland, which dates from the 11th century. He's generally considered a symbol of valor and chivalry. He didn't have anything to do personally with Dubrovnik and probably never got closer than 1,200 miles from the city. The column dates from 1419 as a symbol of Dubrovnik's freedom amidst the hostile neighboring powers and its continuing status at that time as a free state. They built a statue to him because he represented the fight against oppression. People need heroes, and Orlando was available. The rector's palace was the seat of the church rectors of Dubrovnik from the time it was first built until 1808. The original building was actually destroyed by a fire in 1435, was rebuilt and renovated several times, including after that great earthquake. It's a blend of Gothic, Renaissance, and Baroque styles, and today is a museum. Notice the dress style of the men in the detail photo I've added onto this for you. They are distinctly Renaissance looking, in my opinion. This Baroque cathedral stands on the same site as at least 4 previous buildings dating back to the 7th century when Dubrovnik was first founded. Dubrovnik's patron saint is St. Blaise. Both he and St. Joseph are represented in the niches on either side of the main facade, and there's an elegant dome visible from all over the city. The legend says that Richard Lionheart contributed money to build the cathedral, at least one of them, after he was shipwrecked near here in 1172 on his way home from the Third Crusade. He was apparently cast aground on an island outside of the city called Lokrum. He survived his shipwreck, went on his way, but was eventually captured by Austrian Duke Leopold V somewhere near Vienna. Richard promised an offering in the form of a contribution to a church on the spot where he washed ashore, but when he talked about it with the city leaders, they convinced him it would be much better to build the church inside the city walls of Dubrovnik instead. The cathedral from Richard's time, like so much else, was destroyed in the 1667 earthquake. If there was any trace of his offering, I couldn't find it. The current building was completed in Baroque style in 1713 after the earthquake. It was repaired after another earthquake in 1979 and after the Great Siege of 1991. Jews first appeared in Dubrovnik in the early 1400s, and the community grew after they were expelled from Spain in 1492. The Jews settled in and became traders and merchants, which is what they had done in Spain. In 1515, they were actually expelled from the Republic of Dubrovnik, although it wasn't consistently enforced. By 1546, city officials created an official Jewish settlement, or ghetto, inside the city, complete with a main street called the Ulica Żydowska, or Jewish Street. The synagogue building dates from 1652, and it today is mostly a museum, although they do have services whenever they can turn up the minimum number of adult males required. Getting to it is no small task. That street I mentioned is basically just steps, and the steps leading up from the street to the synagogue itself are narrow and quite steep. As far as I can tell, there is no elevator. The building, called Sponza Palace, dates from the early 1500s, and its Renaissance style reflects the trade and cultural exchanges with Renaissance Italy, and I suspect particularly Venice. The building is remarkable not so much for its design, but for the fact that it survived the 1667 earthquake virtually intact. They refer to it as a palace, but as far as I can tell, it was never used as a residence. To survive that earthquake, it must have been extraordinarily sturdily built. There's another clue to the strength of its construction. Among its uses over the years were as a customs office and a bonded or secured warehouse, the home of a mint, an armory, a treasury, and a bank. All of these facilities would have been heavily guarded. I like the inscription over the arch in the atrium, which reads, "Our weights do not permit cheating. When I measure goods, God measures me." The Church of St. Blaise is a Baroque-style building honoring the patron saint of the city, built on the site of a 14th century Romanesque-style church that was damaged by the 1667 earthquake, but which was only destroyed in 1706 by a fire. At the top is a freestanding statue of the saint himself. Blaise was a bishop in what is modern-day Turkey. He was a physician venerated for his kindness, not just to human beings, but to animals, and known for his healing power and miracles. Blaise met a fairly gruesome end. Toward the end of the organized Roman imperial persecutions of Christians under Emperor Licinius, he was arrested and tortured with hot iron combs, tools used in wool production, and was eventually beheaded around 316 AD. Because of the association of his martyrdom with something to do with wool, those combs I mentioned, he became the patron saint of wool combers. But he also had several miracles which are required to be elevated to sainthood. The story goes that he rescued a child who was choking to death on a fishbone, and because of that became the patron and benefactor of all of those suffering from throat illnesses and ailments. Among these things would have been something like pharyngitis, which I believe is how American President George Washington, more than 1,000 years later, died, the common cold, influenza, and more. In Blaise's day, and for a very long time after that, about the only thing that could be offered were honey, which did have some antiseptic properties, herbs, warm liquids, and prayers. Blaise is also considered one of the patrons of veterinarians because of his love of animals and his ability to heal their wounds. The story goes that for a while he retreated from humanity, and the animals in the forest were always at peace in his presence because he treated them with dignity. This story sticks in my mind because my father was a veterinarian. The last thing I want to show you is a photo of the tile roofs in the Old Town. Notice how many of them look shiny, new, and perfect compared to the small patch visible here of much older tiles. During the siege of the city, almost every roof in town was destroyed and had to be replaced. The buildings were repaired and rebuilt using the same or visually similar materials from the originals. Those new tiles are a testament to the grit and determination of the civilians in the city who endured and survived the siege when their homes could not. Thank you for joining me today on this Essentials Walking Tour of Dubrovnik. Come back next week for another adventure with me here on The Armchair Traveler.